All right, so I'm Trent Oliphant. Those of you who came to this class thinking you're going to hear Travis Oliphant, I'm not Travis. He is my brother. Hopefully I can be as informative as he is. I do actually work for his company, Continuum, and I'm a developer with Continuum. And I've been working on a project in a fairly large enterprise situation on a consulting project, and so this is about how we use Django, specifically in the data pipeline, to help solve some problems that are actually unique to the enterprise. Okay, I mean, when I hear enterprise data, I think huge data sets and big things like that, and oftentimes you think it's going to look like this. You got this one central data store, and you have some simple process you go through, and you get some clear results out of it. I mean, that's the promise, right, of big data. That's what everyone talks about. But the reality isn't even this clean, where you've got lots of different business centers that all have to consolidate the data, and you have all the extra stuff, and then you have to do a bunch of complex processes to get some results that may or may not be clear. Okay, so that's part of the problem, is just that you've got the data coming from so many different sources. And so it's going to be aggregated, and the problem with aggregation is that how do you know that you've aggregated it on the correct parameters? How do you know that it's been aggregated correctly? You got multiple business centers, multiple places they're coming from, and all of those are different sizes. And they all have different data. Okay, so sure, you may be wanting to gather this all into a single place. But if it's different data, you got to make sure that it all has some common thing some commonalities between them in order to be able to match them up. And even within any given business center, all right, you're going to have multiple data sources with multiple processes, and then you have your own sets of results, and then plus you need to send that on upstream to the corporate. Okay. So that's just a kind of a general problem that an enterprise has, but on the business center, you're going to have your own reporting needs. You need to feed it upstream, and plus you've got a smaller team and smaller budgets and oftentimes smaller data. With enterprise IT departments, often they have policies that they're trying to do, for everybody, and they've got solutions that are supposed to be for everybody. And so that makes it often difficult for smaller data teams, in a business center that they're just trying to do their data reporting. Anyone here work on a small data team inside of a larger enterprise? Okay, yeah, it's very, very common. There's a need for data scientists in there, and unfortunately, sometimes that support's not there, the tools aren't there. Corporations and enterprises are recognizing this, and so while it's been slow in coming and it's still not fully there, open source has become an option. Okay, there's actually a lot of good reasons for enterprises to adopt and allow open source technologies within the organization. First of all, there's cost. I mean, that's often a huge factor. But it's also has become easier to use. I mean, I know that when it first started off, I've been working with open source for 20 years now, and it was painful to do things in the beginning. You had to roll your own, and that's still some of the disadvantages of distribution and installation. How do you get all of those things? And the support, especially in an enterprise level, is problematic. Because while one of the advantages of open source is you have this extremely broad community with all this information, you've got GitHub, you can share, solutions are shared, Stack Overflow. If you have that's become the go-to source for me anyway. If I have a question, I can go to Stack Overflow and see if anyone else has had this similar problem. And now with anaconda.org as well, there's just different places to share the solutions with each other. Unfortunately, in the enterprise, some of those solutions can't ever get out. And so they're not shareable. You have proprietary data, you've got non-disclosure agreements, all sorts of things that you're working on, and so the sharing doesn't happen, and in fact, it often doesn't even happen within the enterprise. So someone may have done it on another team, but when we're talking to an organization that has over 100,000 employees, it doesn't matter that someone has already done this somewhere else. If you don't know about it, you're going to have to just redo it. Okay, so those are some of the problems that we face in working with open source. Now, I mean, there are solutions around it. Anaconda Enterprise. This is a small shameless plug for Anaconda Enterprise that helps solve some of those problems. You can have a central repository that is controllable by the corporate or the enterprise IT staff. But it allows for easy package deployment and collaboration as well as support, and a big thing is the indemnification. That seems to concern a lot of managers. They don't care as much about the technical superiority. It's, well, who's going to answer for a problem that comes up? Okay, so we chose to use Django as part of the solution. No, this is just a part of a solution, and this is not a tutorial about setting up a Django website. This is specifically how we used Django to solve some of the problems that are inherent in corporations. Who in here is not familiar with Django to some extent? Does everyone okay? So what Django is, for those that may not know, and I'd suggest that you go to djangoproject.com. They've got excellent documentation. But it's a web framework, and it's written in Python, and it follows the model view template model, which most web frameworks, Ruby on Rails, can't think of any off the top of my head right now. They call it a model view control, or model controller view, or model view controller. It's the same thing. Django just uses a different terminology for it, but it's called a model view template. And now you're thinking, okay, we're not building a website here. This is data tools. So why are you using this? Why are you using a web framework in the first place? And the challenge, or the part of the reason is that provides an easy way to share the data. And so you're not just passing things around, okay? It has a built-in web server, so it makes it really easy to create user interfaces. Now, everything I'm talking about here, I'm going to give some examples and some actual code of what we did, but all of what I'm sharing relies on version 1.8 or higher, okay, which is a pretty newer version. So they made some changes recently. So if you have older versions, some of this code may not work for you, or you have to do it just differently. You can probably make it work, but the syntax may have changed. So why go with Django? Since there are a lot of these other types of options out there, it's easy install and setup. It has built-in ORM, built-in authentication, built-in admin interface. I mean, so basically, one of the main reasons was it had a lot of stuff already in the package. We didn't have to try to cobble it together. Okay, it was just install and go. And another big reason is the talent pool. Okay, and we'll get to that here a little bit more. Now, as far as easy install and setup, this honestly is how easy it is to get a Django project going. You just conda install Django. You can also pip install. Because it's all in pure Python, it's really quite easy to set up. And then you create a project, and it has a built-in development web server. Now, right there in the documentation, and it says don't use this web server for any production. And that is a good idea, but it makes it really easy for development purposes. And you just run the server, manage.py run server. So it's easily installed and set up. That's to get the server running. Now, of course, you have to get your site up, and you have to get all of your code written. It won't do that for you. But then the Django ORM. Anyone not know what ORM stands for? It's object relational mapper, okay? Because most of our data is going to be in a tabular format, oftentimes in a SQL database. Okay, that's the most common is a SQL database, and that's what an ORM generally does. You can connect to some NoSQL, and you just have, but it basically converts from a relational type database into an object model, which programmers like to program a little bit more in objects. Makes it a little bit easier to write code for than having to write all of the SQL statements. Okay, so also Django will handle the DB management for you, so it can create your tables, it can create your indexes. It has all that code to create that. You work with the objects and properties, not with the SQL directly, but if you need to, say you have some esoteric join that you need to do on multiple tables and subqueries, you can still do that. You can connect directly to the database. In fact, one of the examples I'll be showing, we do bypass the ORM layer and go directly to the database to just run the SQL statement. Okay, so that comes built in. Now you've also got built-in authentication. So it can manage users for you and groups and session. You know, it has built-in session management. So when someone logs in, you don't have to be checking every single time. So they've got all of that already taken care of. We didn't have to build it ourselves. Didn't have to run it in. And they have some basic permissions where which users can do what things. And then it has a really easy to use admin interface. Now it's called admin, but basically you can look at the actual data itself. Okay, look at the tables. It's not super featured like a SQL, a SQL tool, a Toad, or even a command line SQL. You can't run SQL statements from the admin interface. But if you're looking at the data and you just need to maybe change something really quickly, from the user interface, you can go into that and easily change the data, which allows for basic data entry and editing. Okay, again, this is basic, but it's built in. It's very simple to plug into, and you don't have to build it yourself. And then another thing that isn't as much of a consideration in an open source project necessarily, but is definitely a huge consideration in an enterprise, is the talent pool. In other words, what is the availability of someone to replace you? I know that we don't like to think about that. It's like, well, why would you ever want to replace me? They probably don't, but you may want to leave. Okay? And then, so if you've built this esoteric solution that no one else can come in and do, you've created a little bit of technology debt. I want to thank Jim Kitchen for that word right there. You've created a cost there for someone else to come along and try to understand it. And so, sure, people may not want to use a tool like Django because it has so much in it that's, oh, well, I don't need that. That's just extra. Why can't I just do my own thing, roll my own? Well, you need to be replaced. So it's often good to maybe even trade off some features, especially in the enterprise, trade off some features for a better community. And Django has a very large and active community. They have conferences, lots of developers building plugins. And so therefore there's a lot of available people to help on the projects. I used to be very against frameworks in general until I started working in an enterprise and seeing how important that commonality is in reproducibility. Okay, so of course you can always ask questions, well, what about this package or that package? SQL Alchemy, Flask, and TurboGears. I mean, even within the Python framework, web framework community, you've got all of those available. Those are all great packages. We just happen to have decided on Django, and there's some specific reasons that we did versus Flask versus Django, and part of it was the more all-inclusive. I've only barely started looking at TurboGears. It looks really, really interesting. But obviously once you start with something, and especially in an enterprise, and then you've got a solution working, you don't just go changing it just to change it. So, all right, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the specifics of our project, just in some general terms. So we had some requirements. Basically what it was is that we're forecasting, doing some financial forecasting. It's a very common project in an enterprise. And so we weren't actually doing the modeling ourselves. They have a special team to do the forecasting. What we were brought in to do was to automate that, to automate the process of doing these forecasts. It was a very heavy, complex process that they wanted to make easier, and part of that requirement was to have a simple user interface. And they needed to have the ability to regularly update the data. So this is forecasting that needs to happen on a continual basis, and so people need to say, okay, I need to upload new data now. I need to get my new data? I need to have that. And because of the nature of who was working with this information, is that we had to integrate with Excel. Now I put integration in quotes there because it's not a direct integration, it's just that we had to take that into consideration in the workflow. It's not that we're trying to control this from Excel or control Excel directly from this, so it's not that tight integration, it's a very loose integration. But I would say that, I would argue that Excel is probably the most widely used data tool in the world. Okay, now a lot of data scientists say, well, that's not a data tool. Well, it is. It's a data tool. and non-programmers, non-data scientists use it extensively. And so that was an important part of the requirement, is that we were able to somehow tie into the Excel usage. Okay, so the teams that we had for this, we had 4 different groups. We had our modelers, the modeling group, we had our finance group, we had our data group, and we had then the development group. So I was part of the development group, and a big part of it was automating the actual models that were being created, converting them into Python. They actually built the models in Excel, and we could see how untenable that was for any kind of scalability or usability. But that's how the modelers and the finance team, that's how they were able to work together, because they're both very familiar with that. They also did some testing in SAS. In fact, these are some of the tools that were used. They used SAS and Oracle and Teradata. The actual data that we worked on was actually an aggregation of millions of rows of transactional data that was stored in Teradata. We were doing work on the aggregation of that, and so they would aggregate it up to Oracle and SAS. And so the modelers and the finance, they worked with SAS and Excel to come up with the model itself, and then we as a development team figured out how to translate that into Python, runnable Python code. And that's actually another interesting discussion as to how some of the solutions that we came up with that one. But then there was the data team, and we were working most directly with the data team because we were trying to solve their pain. All right, because the modeling people would come to them and say, hey, we need this data here, and then they'd have to figure out this process to get them the data they needed. And so a lot of what we did was to help the data team. And then besides those 4 groups, we also have other outside influences. You've got corporate finance that has their needs. You've got corporate IT that you've got to deal with, because you have to make sure you're complying with all of the policies, provisioning of machines. And then we also had internal corporate audit. The internal corporate audit team we had to work with, and then regulations. Even outside the company, you've got laws and rules and things that you have to deal with. And if you're dealing with any publicly traded company, regardless of whether they work with the government or not, just the fact that they're publicly traded, they have to have, there are certain things that are regulated with regards to the data. Okay, we already talked about the tools used. Just quickly, some of the environments that we had. We actually had to have 3 separate servers Excuse me. In retrospect, I think we would have liked to have gone with 4 servers. Just because of the nature of what the production, the UAT, the user acceptance testings, the production, we had no access to production whatsoever as developers. So it needed to be a complete solution. So user acceptance testing was the closest that we could ever get to that. And it would have been nice to be able to fully replicate production on UAT, and then us have 2 machines for development and then integration or preparation. And we all had, and everyone has their own workstations, and the workstations are just desktops or laptops with a Windows 7 Enterprise on it, but they're locked down. Okay, you can only do what's approved by the company. We can't just go and install anything we wanted to. Now the servers that we had working with, we had Oracle servers and we had Linux running Apache. They actually have a whole stack on that. It's a specific install. We were very fortunate. They had, because it takes months sometimes to get a server provisioned to be able to use. By the time we got there, they had already been in that process for 6 or 7 months. So we already had the servers. We didn't have to wait for them to be provisioned. So that's something that oftentimes in open source you don't have to think about, is how do we deal with those, with waiting for the proper things. Now, a little bit about the data itself. As I said before, it's aggregated from Teradata, and we actually had a relatively small set of data with comparison to other teams. But we still, even with that, we had 115 different tables that we were working with. And each and we would do a forecasting run. Okay, that's what they were doing. And each run would generate about 30 megabytes of data. So again, we're not talking big data here. This is all manageable even on a laptop. I mean, it's not big data. So that wasn't the problem. Wasn't a problem of scale. The problem was it was a problem of operations. Now each month, the future data, the ones that they had forecasted, would become real the next month. They'd say, okay, this is now real. So they had to be able to update that. Plus, what if they wanted to create a new scenario? Well, let's suppose that this variable does this instead, or let's suppose that this one does that. So they wanted to be able to create new future data sets as well, new scenarios. Okay, so some specific issues that Django was solving. The biggest one is data governance and controls. Okay, everything so much of what we do is we always have to ask ourselves the question, what is this? How does this relate to the rules, the corporate rules, the enterprise rules regarding the data governance? Now, is anyone not familiar with what data governance is? Anyone had not heard that term before? Okay, so most of you probably had to deal with it. A big thing was that only certain people should be able to even have access to the data, and we had to certify and verify that was the case, and so we had to go through the corporate single sign-on process. Okay, and we had to be able to have user-level access control and then validation to make sure that the data fits within the guidelines. Other problems that we had was just sharing the data. As I said, the finance and modeling team, they would just share Excel files back and forth. Well, one of the problems is that, okay, now I've got which version of the file am I using? I've made modifications. Okay, who changed that? And then on the database end, you have concerns about who has access to what tables to be able to modify which data. Now, when it came time to actually implementing this to production, we had limited machine access. Okay, so on those production and UAT machines, you have no shell access at all. In order to get anything done with that, you got to give that to a third-party install. Okay, you've got to go to fill out a ticket and have corporate IT do that. I see some smiles out here because I can tell that you guys, this is obviously a problem that you guys are very familiar with. Okay, so we're going to go with talk about some specific things that we did, and these may or may not fit and help you in your specific situation. If there's maybe something that we didn't cover in here, we may have actually solved it, but I just didn't fit it into our solutions. And so feel free to come and talk to me about your specific problem, and we'll see if we can't, if maybe we don't have some insight here. Okay, so now we're going to get some details about how we use Django. Who in here has actually ever done an application in Django? Has anybody done an application in Django? Okay, so you would be somewhat familiar with kind of how the data flows. You have a request that comes in. This is the second line here. You have a request that comes in and goes through some middleware. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Does the URL resolution, then the view resolution, then the template, and then you sends back the response. Okay, that's great once you get to Django. But on our system, first we had an Apache server. Okay, which Apache integrates fairly nicely with Django. It's a little bit more of a hassle than with others, but it's not that difficult to do. The biggest problem was, though, is that we didn't actually get the actual HTTP request from Apache, because it had to go through this SSO agent that sat on the machine. That's what verified, so people would go and log in to the, they'd use the SSO authentication, and then that request would then be sent to Django. Okay. Now, a couple of solutions that I'm going to talk about specifically are in middleware. So that's why I put this in here. It's normally not shown in the, it's there because there's some built-in middleware, but when you're building a simple web application, you don't always think about the middleware. And that's actually a really good place to look. So if what I've done doesn't match any one of your scenarios, and you're thinking about, well, how do I make this work? Chances are it's going to be in the middleware somewhere. Okay, just because of where it sits. Now, middleware, even though I have it there before the URL resolution, it can actually go also between the URL resolution and the view resolution, and there's also another layer between the template resolution, and then there's actually 5 different entry points for middleware within that chain, and that's all in the Django documentation. But so just think in your mind, can I solve this through doing some middleware entry point? And then the other thing about this is that your models, now this is where it's going to get a little bit confusing, because the models are, this is Django models, so which correspond to the Django tables. So the first thing was integrating with authentication. So yes, we're using Django authentication, but we needed to customize it to integrate with the SSO. So first of all, we just created a custom authentication object, and then created a middleware class, and we updated our settings file to be able to recognize that. Okay, so the settings.py file, for those that haven't worked with Django, that's where you set, and it's exactly what it sounds like. It's the settings for Django to know what it's doing. So those are the 2 specific places that we changed. So here's some code, and all of this code is actually available up on a GitHub repo that I've got a link at the end. So if you want to look at this code, it's not runnable in its current state because they're just snippets. All right, but it's a good model. So this is just how you generally do a custom authentication. You create a class, and it has to have 2 functions in it: authenticate and get user. Okay, that's the API for doing a custom authentication. Now, what we did is we created a specific authentication that read the HTTP headers. Okay, that's what we ended up passing in the credentials. So we would get the username, and then we'd say, all right, if you're, let's look and see if the user's in there. If they're not, if they weren't in there, we went ahead and created the user. Now that worked in our specific case because we knew that people would only be coming to it that had access to the whole system. So we could very easily modify this to only to not add them as a new user, but take them to a form that they can be added as a user. But this one we wanted to make it as seamless as possible, so we just automatically added them. And then we set them up though as inactive users. So sure, they were now entered in the system, but they still had to actually request permission from the administrator to be able to have access to specific parts of the system. that was part of the governance. We needed there has to be this multi-step process. Okay, and then we create a middleware class. So this is what's going to be called every time a function comes in, and it's a process request. All of the 5 entry points start with process. Okay, and then we just set up the line in red on the bottom. That's our middleware. So these functions will be run in order. Now notice there's a bunch of them that start with Django. Those are built into Django. By default, they're there. You don't have to use them, but all of them are very powerful. And I'm not, unless you wanted to replace one of those with one of your own, just leave them there and go ahead and use them. All right, and then the authentication backend. We put our authentication first because that's what we wanted it to check first. But we also included, though, the Django authentication. So that if the authentication of our backend failed, it would then go on to check the next one. The way that it works is that Django checks the very first authentication. So you could actually have 3 or 4 different authentication backends. If you had different things, you would just have them listed here in the order you wanted them to be attempted. Okay, so then another thing we did to help with development is we would actually mock the integration, because you saw to get something actually on the servers was tricky, but we needed to have that to know how that was going to work. And so we created a simple function that with a YAML file we could mock who was logging in, and then here's the code to get the mocked headers, and so we replaced the headers, or we added to the headers rather. And so here's the code itself that in the middleware class, we just updated the middleware class to look and see, is there a standard ID that came in? Because that was added by that SSO agent that was in there. That's how we got those headers in there, that was added by the SSO agent. And so it's like, okay, if that's already there, all right, then don't worry about it. Just we're just going to we do what we did in the normal class. Otherwise, our headers are now our mocked headers. Okay, and then this is just the code for us to be able to switch quickly between. We just go into this YAML file, and so I replace Trent up there with Bob, and now all of a sudden when I go to view the page, it thinks I'm Bob. Okay. All right. So now, access control was an interesting thing. Django has built-in permissions, but the permissions in Django are at a model level, which correlates to the table level. Well, that's great if that's how you're going to present your data, but oftentimes our forms are across lots of different tables, and so we created a UI permissions, which basically would be on a view-based or a page level. So first we had to create a custom content type and a model manager, as well as a custom permission model that's based on the permissions. Then we had to register it, and we add a decorator to the views. Okay, so it's a little bit more of a complex process, but you can see that each of these pieces is actually very small. So with the content type, we simply it's an entry in the database. Okay, in the content types table. Django content type table, and you can either do it directly in the database or through the admin interface. Create a custom permissions manager that calls the permission manager, but then does a filter on it. Okay, because the permission that we created here is just a subclass of the built-in permissions. And the main reason we did this, we didn't have to do this, but the main reason we did this is that with 115 tables, and we only have like maybe 5 different views that people had to look at, but they would have to go search through all those tables to find the right permission. So we wanted to have these in its own set in the admin interface. Okay, and then we just add the permission to the view using the decorator. Okay, so then another thing that we had was, okay, how do people get access to the output files? Or even to the output in the database, because according to the controls, they couldn't actually, many of the users didn't have rights to the database. So they couldn't just go to a database and write a query. So but if they wanted to get the data, we had to provide an interface for them to do that. And many of them wanted it in an Excel file. So we would create the Excel files that would either email or be able to download. Plus, we would generate, for especially during development, extra debug information. We'd store those on the file system in CSV files, and then plus we have our log files, and all of those need to be accessible. We were actually I was surprised anyway, to find that the log files have to be accessible for audit purposes. It makes sense when I thought about it, but I just hadn't thought about it before. Okay, so to create an Excel file, we used XLS Writer and then pandas. So basically we created pandas data frame and then wrote each query to its own tab, created an Excel file. I don't have the code here. It's just pretty straightforward as far as XLS. You use the add table function into a worksheet. But the download file, I want to show you this because this actually is within Django. See, that was just a separate function to create the Excel spreadsheet, but we would call that then from Django. To download the file, we use this, it's called File Wrapper. And the reason we did that is because File Wrapper actually will provide chunked, it'll chunk it for you. You don't have to worry about, so you really don't have to worry about the data size. Because everyone says, well, everything I was reading about it when we were doing this is, oh no, you don't want to have Django serve your large files. Well, we kind of had to, because some of these files were created on the fly. They weren't at a static location. And so this is just some code to do that and return it. We just changed the headers with the response so that the browser knows, oh, I'm getting a file. And then, so now they have the ability to get an Excel file, which is what they want to have, but we've controlled the data. We've controlled who was able to download that Excel file because of the permissions that are set. Now, the same is true within uploading data. Okay, this was the one that they really wanted to solve. So we created a simple form, and then we had a rule. They would provide the users would provide the data in an Excel file, and we actually have on the site a downloadable file that they can do, an Excel template. So then they can just put the new data in there and go back and upload it in here. And we provided that because the tab names had to match the table model names. All right, here's the code itself. This is very cleaned up. We did a lot of error checking, and now one thing to notice down here, the Django wrapper of the CX Oracle connection. So this is here where I do raw SQL, because we wanted to do execute many, and the way Django does execute many is a little bit odd and didn't really fit our needs. Okay, and so we wanted to run just the raw execute many of inserting into the table, but the CX Oracle connections expects a slightly different format than Django delivers it, and Django wraps the CX Oracle connection, and so we had to pretend that this was Django created, and Django creates it by putting in that value holder there. So we couldn't just create it in the format that CX Oracle wanted, even though ultimately that's what the tool that was really putting it into the database. We just had to do it that way. So that's what that note is in there for. Okay, talk a little bit about the administration. We're pretty much out of time here. So there's a bunch of other things in here that the slides are available. Let me just go to the last slide here. Oh, sorry, went too far. Okay, so if you have any questions, feel free to talk to me afterwards. I can share with you. But you can look at these slides, and the sample code that's in here is all available on these points here. You've got on SlideShare. I've got first time I've used SlideShare, I didn't realize that it was going to take the name of my presentation and turn it into that long. Although you can't miss this one up with any other presentation there. So thank you very much.